Good morning, brothers. Today we are going to speak about Horace. Born in the year 65 BC and died in the year 8 BC. As you see, we are going a little back in time if we compare him with Ovid, but nonetheless, I think the maturity of his poetry is enough for us to consider him after Ovid. Just a quick parenthesis here. This is the last class we are having before the midterm exam, right? Because this coming Thursday, we can dedicate it to your questions. So whatever questions you have, you can bring them up this Thursday. After that, next Thursday, you have the midterm exam. Okay, just to make it clear. Before we completely dive into Horace, I just want to make a few final remarks about Ovid. Because I suppose you read the first 5 elegies of Ars Amandi by Ovid, which you have in the anthology. So I just wanted to explain a little about what you have read. First, these poems in Latin are written in elegiac distich, which is the metrical pattern that Ovid used. Why? Well, because that's the metrical pattern proper of elegy and of love poetry. I think that's clear, right? We've mentioned it before. This work was finished around the year 2 AD. And I mentioned this was a parody of a didactic poem, right? Well, the fact that it's a parody doesn't mean that it lacks depth or reflection. And actually, I consider it as a deeply reflective poem. And as far as I know, it's one of those first instances where we find what we will call meta-poetical. Again, meta-poetical or meta-poetry. Something meta-poetical is something that transcends poetry itself. So, I can write a poem about spring, I can write a poem about love, I can write a poem about war, I can write a poem about a wide variety of themes. But when we use the term metapoetical, we're referring to a poem about poetry itself. A poem that reflects about poetry itself. And this might have gone unnoticed when you read the beginning of the Ars Amatoria. I don't know if you noticed to what extent this was a metapoetical poem. A poem that reflects about poetry. That is why Ovid has been named the most sincere poet. Not because he's sincere in expressing his own feelings. Actually, there are many other poets who do that better than Ovid. Tibullus, for example, Catullus, for example, Propertius. All of them speak very plainly, I would say very transparently, about their own feelings. In Ovid, we almost have this division between Ovid, the poet, and Ovid, the person. So there's this separation. But I think Ovid can very well be named a very sincere poet, inasmuch as he lets us know what goes through the poet's mind. So we find that Ovid, as a poet, is erudite. He knows a lot, he can reference a lot of sources, He can bring them in a very smooth way. And at the same time, he's practically omniscient. He knows everything that is going on. Whereas Ovid, as a person, or as a lover, is someone who's naive and unaware of his surroundings. So when he uses the first person, he's referring to himself as the lover, who's Ovid himself, but nonetheless he discloses his poetical person, his poetical personality. This is why I see in the elegies a profoundly metapoetical poem, a poem that reflects about poetry. Let me explain why. There are the first 5 books that you have in the anthology have to be envisioned as a unity. There's a common theme that brings those 5 books together. So, if you remember, the first one deals with Ovid as a person who's attempting to write an epic poem. He tries to write a great epic. And what happens? Cupid comes and takes away one bit from every other line, turning his hexameters into an elegiac distich. In the second book, he's caught with desire and he can't sleep. We have a sleepless poet who's thinking about a woman. He tries to resist, but in the end, he yields. Third, he describes that woman who is incredibly beautiful, and he compares her with Io, Leda, and Europa. All of them mythical figures, and all of them very beautiful women of Greek mythology. The fourth book, he goes into a supper where his idealized woman is present with her husband. So there's a barrier. There's an obstacle that they have to surmount, right? And Corinne lets him know about a secret way to communicate. And in book 5, they finally encounter. Good. So this, that would seem a very plain narrative, has a profound metapoetical reflection. The beginning is almost like another Aeneid. And here you can see the echoes of Virgil himself, who at this time was already very influential. And that canno, I sing, of the Aeneid, re-echoes also here. So we have Ovid who's attempting to write a great epic poem, probably like the Aeneid. But Ovid finds himself more at ease with elegiac distich rather than hexameter. So for him, the elegiac distich flows more smoothly. So it's not like he's compelled by a divinity to write a love poem, but it happens exactly the other way around. He's compelled by his own self to write an elegiac distich, and this metrical pattern is proper to love poetry. That is why he has to end up writing a love poem. That is what he is saying in a very sincere, in a very transparent way. He says, you, readers, you usually read a poem and you think that the poet is chanting the glories and the luminosity of his own love life, right? And then he starts penning it down according to the proper metrical pattern Ovid says it's exactly the other way around. We have a metrical pattern, and then we have to fill in whatever fits. That is what he's saying in the first book. So once you get the metrical pattern, you create the theme. The hesitation in book 2. He hesitates. Should I dedicate myself to love poetry even if I don't have anything to talk about? Can I write a poem about a woman that is not there, that I don't know, that I don't love? So there's the hesitation, right? And in the end, he yields, because he says, I do have this metrical pattern, so I have to fit something within this metrical pattern. And the very name of Corinna, right, in Latin, which is Greek for Corinne, means little girl. So the name in itself could be any woman. It's just a mere occasion. That woman is just an occasion for him to write a poem. Now he has to create this ideal and abstract woman. And that is why he compares her with mythical figures of the past. That beauty is completely fictitious. It's a figment of his imagination. At least that's Ovid's narrative. He's saying, I don't think I really encountered a woman as beautiful as Leda. I am making this woman. I am creating her, and I want her to be as beautiful as Leda, and as beautiful as Io, and as beautiful as Europa. All of those mythical figures that were also women loved by Zeus himself. But Zeus always had to change his shape. He had to shift shapes. This is what Ovid is also saying to us. I am the creator of this woman, but at the same time, I have to model myself according to whatever circumstance is pertinent to fit in and to fit into this scheme that I myself have created. So that's why I as a poet can assume many shapes. Now, it would be too easy if I encounter the woman and everything flows smoothly. So Virgil needs to bring in an obstacle. That woman is married. So let's make it challenging. Let's make it difficult for us. And not only is she married, but her husband is right there next to her. So he's just creating an obstacle to add intensity to the plot. But, as in every novel, at least the Greek standard novel in those times, this all leads to a happy ending where the obstacle is removed or surmounted, and then we have book 5 with a happy ending. So what Ovid is saying here might be nothing else than this is how a poem is written. So don't think that we have a very intense experience that then we try to pen down as a poem, but it happens exactly the other way around. We want to write a poem, and therefore, for that purpose, we create that experience. Okay, so I think this is a good way to finish with Ovid. Of course, for this very reason, Ovid has been often named, called frivolous or cold, or people say that his poetry, his love poetry, lacks true passion. And I think it's sound criticism to make, right? You can, if you compare him with other poets, definitely you can say that his love poetry lacks that passion. But at the same time, you can also see that his verse flows very smoothly. In one of the studies that I referenced last unit, George Luke says, in Ovid there's so much talent that he squanders it. Yeah, he doesn't need to be selective in what he uses in the investing of his talent. He just lets his talent flow smoothly to the point where he can even squander it and misuse it. But that talent is very well invested in a poem like this, because he's revealing to us what actually goes through a poet's mind. And this is why Ovid has been also called the poet of sincere love. Okay? And I close my presentation of Ovid, and now let me speak a little more about Horace. Are there any questions before we finish Ovid? Yes?
So this adultery was not something real, was more like a mental construction or literary construction?
At least in Ovid's understanding, I would say it's I don't know how real and how many things he went through his life.
Okay.
And if by the age of 30 he was already divorced 2 times and he was in his 3rd marriage, maybe it's not all a figment of his imagination. But nonetheless, what he's attempting to show here is what goes through a poet's mind.
Okay.
Right? So I'm not disqualifying experience itself. But what Ovid is doing here is showing us how the poetical intent precedes whatever experience you might have or want to have or create. Right. Good, but thank you for the question. Horace. Born in the year 65 BC, he died in the year 8 BC, and his father had been captured and he had been sold into slavery. But fortunately for Horace, his father could free himself, and Horace was born free. So all this happened before the birth of Horace. His father could afford him a good education. And at the age of 19, shortly after Horace's father had died, he went and traveled to Athens. In Athens, Horace encountered Marcus Cicero, not the great Cicero, but his son. And also Pompey, or Pompeius. So he encountered and befriended these great Roman figures. And he also studied Epicurean philosophy and Stoic philosophy. You can see that on a general scheme, Epicureanism and Stoicism contrast. You could see that you could say that they are conflicting schools of philosophy. But since Horace is not a philosopher, he really doesn't have any problem in blending things together. Right. You cannot. He would not bother to offer some philosophical system or some philosophical coherence. Yes. So in some of his poetry, in some of his poems, you are going to encounter a profoundly Stoic mindset. In some others, you are going to find a profoundly Epicurean mindset. And that doesn't take away from the fact that it is the same poet who's writing this. Besides, we can also think that Horace goes through different stages in his life, and he used whatever philosophy was appropriate for that particular moment of his life without any intent to create a coherent system. That is the main reason why I brought Horace in after Ovid, because especially when it comes to love poetry, some scholars have said that the poetry of Horace, the love poetry of Horace, is not looking into the heart, it's looking into the brain. So with Horace, we see a very detached, a very analytical mindset. We don't find that passion that we find in other poets, and even that, you could call it that adventure, that excitement, that quest that Ovid presents to us is absent in Horace, especially in his later poetry. So he's just reflecting from a detached mindset. Maybe he's reflecting about his experiences during his youth, but above all now he assumes a stoic role where passion in itself is something to be avoided. That's, and you all understand the difference between Stoicism and Epicureanism, right? Yes. No. Epicureanism, to put it simply, is a hedonistic philosophy that tries to procure itself as much pleasure as it can possibly get. It doesn't necessarily mean a low pleasure, because they also speak about pleasure of friendship, for example, right? Or pleasure of knowledge, or pleasure of wisdom. But of course, there are also many other types of pleasure that are not commendable. And Epicureanism will try to foster this pleasure with some kind of moderation. Why? To get more pleasure in the future, right? If today I eat to the point where I get sick, then that will bring me discomfort. Instead, I should keep some moderation in my eating, so tomorrow I can continue eating, right? So there's this caricature about Epicureanism that considers it some kind of gross philosophy. It definitely might lead in some extremes to that, but that's extreme, and a philosophy shouldn't be considered or judged by its extremes. So of course there's also some moderation in it. Instead, Stoicism is practically the opposite. So I have to be imperturbable. Nothing can touch me. In Greek, it's ataraxia. Taratein means to, or tarasein means to trouble. So I am untroubled. Nothing moves me. And they do take it to extremes. They do take it to extremes. Let me just give you two examples. One of them is Anaxagoras. Once news came to him that his son had just died. And he replied, I never thought he was immortal. Another example of Stoicism, a friend tries to tease his other Stoic friend, and he says, so if I twist your arm, you will not complain? No, but you're going to break it. And he continues twisting his arm. You are twisting my arm, but I will not complain. But if you continue doing that, you are going to break it. So he continues twisting it, and he broke it. He says, I told you were going to break it. So, yes. They take it to extremes. So I have to remain untouched. I have to remain unmoved by whatever happens around me, right? It's all within fate, and I have to accept fate as it comes. Therefore, passions and the pleasures, and especially that passion of love, is something to be avoided in that Stoic mindset. Okay, so I hope this explanation has been helpful to understand a little better what the background and the formation of Horace. And again, don't try to find some kind of system, because Horace uses whatever comes helpful in the moment. And especially in his mature age, he would tilt a little more towards Stoicism, and that is why his love poetry is a lot more detached, but at the same time a lot more mature and a lot more reflective. He's just reflecting about how things go without being personally involved, without investing too much of himself into his own poetry. So this is something I just mentioned about the formation of Horace. In the year 42, shortly before the year 42, he joined the military service. And in the year 42, in the Battle of Philippi, he abandoned his shield, following the example of Alcaeus and Anacreon. They both had boasted. They were not ashamed, on the contrary, they made fun of themselves, abandoning their shields in the battlefield, and Horace follows their example. And then he would also mimic their poetry in this regard. He hired himself as a scribe. So you can consider it practically like a bureaucrat in our times. That was pretty much the position Horace had until he encountered Maecenas. That was a life-changing event in his life. Because if it had not been for the encounter of Maecenas, I don't know to what extent Horace would have been renowned and to what extent he would have been able to dedicate himself to poetry. Certainly, before he encountered Maecenas, he had already written his book of satires and his book of epods. So he had managed to write that during his free time, the time he carved out from here and there among his multiple activities as a scribe, right, working for the government. But it was the encounter with Maecenas that freed him from all his everyday activities and enabled him to dedicate himself completely to poetry. Maecenas gifted him a farm with tenants, so it's not like he had to work. The farm came all along with the tenants who were working, who were tilting the land and giving some kind of payment to Horace. So he had plenty to sustain himself, and money was not an issue for him after this. Maecenas was involved with politics, of course, because he was the Minister of Culture for Augustus, and of course he wanted to promote culture, but to a certain end, right? And on the other hand, although he was very close friends with Horace, Horace practically always remained detached from politics. Horace remained detached from politics. He traveled with Maecenas to Brundisium. He traveled to Maecenas in the year 31 to the Battle of Actium, that battle where Augustus defeated Antony and Cleopatra. Back then he was not Augustus, he was Octavian, because it's only until the year 27 when he begins calling himself Augustus. And he dedicated several odes to Augustus, the emperor. And the Carmen Seculare, which you have in the anthology, is that poem he dedicates to the victory of Actium, that victory of Octavian over Antony and Cleopatra. And if you read attentively, you will see that there's no mention of Antony. There is mention of Cleopatra, of course, described as a ferocious monster. But he doesn't mention Antony, and probably it's subject to interpretation, but he didn't want to show the tragedy of a split within the Romans themselves. Of course there was a split, and there were many splits, but Horace prefers not to show that, and he prefers to show it just as a war between Rome and a foreign potency like Egypt. The Egypt of Cleopatra. That's why he only mentions Cleopatra. So he followed along with Maecenas in several of his trips, many of them being political trips, even if he remained detached from politics. And when he was 56, Maecenas died. And shortly after that, he also died. And to honor him and their friendship, they were buried one next to the other. Mm-hmm. Because although Maecenas favored several poets, I don't think any of them had such a close friendship with him as Horace. And a lot that we know about Maecenas is precisely through the odes of Horace. In Horace, we also find, at least from what I know, the most versatile, not necessarily in genre, because Ovid is very versatile in genre, but in metrical patterns. Whereas every line Virgil wrote was a hexameter, and Ovid sometimes writes hexameters, sometimes writes elegiac distichs, but as far as I'm aware, he doesn't explore many other metrical patterns. In Horace, hardly there is a single metrical pattern that is not explored, both from antiquity and from his own times. So we have seen so far hexameters. You will find hexameters in Horace. We have seen elegiac distich. You will find entire epistles written in elegiac distichs. We have seen Sapphic stanzas. We will see very beautiful Sapphic stanzas. One of them he dedicates, at least one of them, but maybe more than one, he dedicates to Maecenas. Est mihi nonum superanti sanum plenus albanica dus est in orto, fili nectendi sapium coronis este de revis. That's a Sapphic stanza he dedicates to, it's longer. I'm just saying the first stanza. That's a stanza he dedicates to Maecenas. And he doesn't say who the ode is dedicated to, because at first he's talking to Phili, some woman named Phyllis. Fili nectendis apium coronis et de revis multa quacrines religata fulges ridet argento vincet aracastis vincta virbunis abet immolatus pargir anno. So he continues describing his villa on and on, and he says he has wine, he says there's a sacrifice on the altar, he's speaking about the plants he has, he's speaking about the servants that go rushing from one place to the other with the trays. He speaks about the smoke and the fire that are ready for cooking. And in the end, he says, maybe you are wondering what's the occasion for all of this. And he says, Findit Aprilem. So it is the month of Venus, April, that right in the middle is cut by this festivity, which was the birth of Maecenas. So this is a poem that Horace wrote to celebrate the birthday of Maecenas. Mm-hmm. So he explores also alchaic stanzas. I think I mentioned this when I was speaking about Alceus. Eheu fugaces postume labunturani nec pietas mora rugis et instantes necte afferretin domiteque morti. So it's the same metrical pattern that we have 11, 11, 9, 10. Beatus ille qui percul negotiis prisca gens mortalium paterna rura bobus exercet suis solutus omni fenore nequest citatur classicum miles trucine corre tiratum mare. So there's an immense variety of metrical patterns, and let me share this poem with you. Exegi monumentum ere perennius, regali quasi tu pyramidum altius, quod non imbere dax, non aquilum potens, posit diruere, aut innumerabilis, annorum series, et fugatem porum. Non omnis moriar multaque pars mei, vita vid libitinam, usque ego postera, crescam laude recens, and so on. I'm going to skip this part, but let me just help you understand what I have just read. Exegi monumentum ere perennius. Exegi, I have erected a monument, a monumentum, ere perennius, more perennial, more lasting than bronze itself. Exegi monumentum ere perennius. Regalique situ pyramidum altius. And my monument, that monument which I erected, is altius, is higher, is loftier than the royal site of the pyramids. Quod non imber edax, non aquilo impotens posit diruere. And this monument neither rains nor winds will be able to deteriorate. aut innumerabilis annorum series et fuga temporum. And the passage of time and the many years will not be able to destroy this monument which I have erected. Okay, and of course that monument is his own poetry. Non omnis moriar. Non omnis moriar. I will not die. Not all of me will die. He knows that he will survive through his poetry. Non omnis moriar. Multaque pars mei, multa pars, a great part of me, vitavit libitinam, will avoid libitinam, which is a divinity of funerals. So a great part of me will avoid, will escape the funeral. And another remark, just notice the frequency of proper names in the poetry of Horace. Maybe there's no other poet in antiquity that uses so many proper names, because he had a very, very wide culture, and he uses that not necessarily like he's believing in a goddess of funerals, but as a literary image. In Virgil, we sometimes find divinities as a poetical device or as a literary device to just embellish the expression, whereas it's not referring necessarily to a divinity. Right? But sometimes in Virgil we do find true allusions to divinity. In Horace, I don't think we ever find mention of a divinity as a divinity. It's always a literary device. But the range of the divinities and the mythological terms and the mythological figures he uses is very vast. It's very vast. So let me just fast forward here to the end of this poem. Dicar qua violenza obstrepitau fidus et qua pauperaque danaus agrestium regnavit populorum et ex humili potens princeps eolium carmen ad italos deduxissimo dos. So Dicar, it will be said of me, he names regions, meaning all over the world, it will be said that it was I who ex humili potens, who became powerful from a humble origin, and princeps, the first one and the principal one, to eolium carmen ad italos deduxisse modos, to transfer Greek carmen, Greek poetry, into italos modos, to Roman or to Italian patterns. Deduxisse modos. Summe superbiam quesitam meritis et mihi delphicam lauro cingevolens Melpomene comam. And he finishes, Melpomene is the goddess of poetry. I think it's of lyrical poetry. It's a muse of lyrical poetry. And he finishes with a dedicatory to her, asking her to crown him with lauro, with laurel, on his head, and he offers her all the merits of his work. Okay, so I think this poem can very well work as a testament. And before we close up, just let me speak, and I think that closes up very well the figure of Horace. Just let me delve a little into his legacy before we finish. Okay, so some Christians, like Prudentius, received Horace and state that Horace can be Christianized. And it's not completely disparaged, because if you consider some liturgical hymns, like I've spoken about Chelitum Joseph, or Utque and Laxis Resonare Fibris, the hymn dedicated to St. John, or Gaudium Mundi Nova Stella Caeli, the hymn dedicated to the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, they are written in Sapphic stanzas. And I ask myself if Christianity would have assumed those metrical patterns had it not been through Horace. Nonetheless, Saint Jerome, you know something about the temper of Saint Jerome, right? So he says, what does Jerusalem have to do with the pagan world? What does Horace have to do with the Psalter? So he's completely contrary to Horace because he himself hadn't been fully invested in Horace during his youth. You know that Saint Jerome had dedicated himself to a thorough study of the great classics. Then in his later life, he repudiated it and he rejected it, at least to some extent, because some say that he continued reading Cicero even in his later years. Anyway, I haven't studied patristics, so I have little to say about Saint Jerome, but I do mention that Saint Jerome, at least in one of his commentaries, not only questions but rejects and repudiates the figure of Horace. He was definitely very influential through his metrical pattern, and Petrarch himself, I think you have to study him for the final exam. Petrarch shaped his own personality after Horace. Virgil was very influential in his thought, but in his personality, he wanted to be another Horace. In the Spanish Golden Century, of course, we find a strong influence of Horace. And I think that the most remarkable one is Oda a la Vida Retirada by Brother Luis de Leon, Fray Luis de Leon. Yes, that Beatus ille qui procul negotis, I think you have it in the anthology. Qué descansada vida la del que huye del mundanal ruido y sigue la escondida senda por donde han ido los pocos sabios que en el mundo han sido. That poem, written by Fray Luis de Leon, is practically a translation of Horace's Beatus ille, which is speaking about a retired life secluded from all the turmoil of the world and that ambition for power and money and gain. I just want to live in the countryside. So if you read the Ode to Secluded Life by Brother Luis of Leon, and you read the Beatus ille by Horace, you are going to see that they are very, very similar. Yes, with one important exception. Horace wrote this in the Book of Satires. So it's a satire, and the very, very, very end, he says, it was in this way that the debtor was thinking. Right. Instead, in Brother Luis of Leon, everything remains in that idyllic realm. But we can definitely see the influence of Horace, and we can see an even greater influence of Horace in William Wordsworth and in John Keats. William Wordsworth and John Keats, great proponents of English Romanticism, and they do draw a lot from Horace. And I think that's it for today. Okay, brothers, are there any questions? Yes.
Repeat the last two authors.
William Wordsworth. Words like words, worth, but all together. William Wordsworth. He's the he's the initiator of English Romanticism. I don't think he's the greatest but he has the merit of starting English Romanticism. And John Keats, Keats. John Keats.
I was wondering, when you said that he escaped the army, what was the consequences of that? They shouldn't kill him or something like this? Or?
I don't know. He didn't have any trouble with stating that he had fled, that he had cast his shield and he had escaped from the army. So, were there any military consequences? Maybe there were, but maybe he was defeated in that. So, who was gonna requisite him? Or who was going to charge him for that? I'm not entirely sure of the military procedures of that time, but if Horace lived to become a great poet and then continue with his life. I don't. If there were any consequences, they were certainly not serious consequences.
I was going to ask, where was he born? Because you said about his father, but it wasn't clear where.
The city is Venusia. Venusia. So he's the Venustian, from the city of Venusia. It's not so far away from Rome, I think.
Regarding Epicureanism, I have a question because, as far as I know, Epicureanism rejects religion. No, at least, for example, in the Rerum Natura, Lucretius asks us to be free of this like way that is over us. No, and you said that he uses the gods just as a literary device. Is that an influence of his Epicureanism or not?
Absolutely, yes, definitely. His Epicureanism, you can question whether it's atheistic or materialistic. Meaning, some Epicureans will say, well, yeah, sure, there are gods, but they are also material. So there's not such thing as a spiritual realm. Everything falls within the material world, and this material world comprehends everything, the gods included. And so they are just immortal, maybe they are subtle, but nonetheless they are material. Okay? And some others will say, no, definitely that's just a figure of speech, and they will deny any divinity and any religion which doesn't necessarily come together. Okay? Because some might adhere to some kind of divinity even if they deny religion, or the other way around, because they might adhere to some religion just for political purposes while inside they deny any divinity. So the connection between religion and their own beliefs, at least in this time during the Roman Empire, has decayed so much that there's hardly any grounding for a true piety. You remember that Virgil's intent, among many other things, was to revive that moral, to revive morals and to revive devotion, right? To what extent he succeeded, I don't know, maybe just for a very scarce minority. But Pope Benedict says it very clearly in Spes Salvi, how that religion had decayed because it was not capable of offering something beyond that.